Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Wednesday, May the 7th. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that gives you everything for the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes in time for your morning commute. The biggest global headline today is the Indian assault on Pakistan-controlled territory, killing at least 19 overnight, which they said targeted terror camps. But we are going to stick to the domestic today, and that also centres on India. Sam, why that?
Well, we're going to be talking about the fallout from the Indian trade deal for quite a lot of this podcast, but also the repercussions of the local elections. In fact, all the grumbles on the terrace last night of the House of Commons were mingling and mixing into one, I have to say. And there was, overnight, actually, quite a direct challenge to Keir Starmer. And my spidey sense suggests that things are going to get a bit worse for Labour before they get better. So I think all of that is fascinating at the moment, how Number 10 deal with it.
And never ignore Sam's spiny sense. There's the fallout from the India trade deal, which Number 10 thought would be a good news story for them, but has some Labour MPs now privately despairing. Meanwhile, the minister in charge of the EU reset negotiations appeared to confirm publicly for the first time that there would be a youth mobility scheme with the EU. But Nick Thomas-Symonds, who is in charge of all that reporting to Keir Starmer, also said it wouldn't be ready for the big May 19th summit. So we apologise possibly for the late running of the youth mobility scheme.
Nothing seems to be going quite right. But in terms of the overall politics of where we are, I think a good place to start is our weekly YouGov voting intention for Sky and The Times, which we often break on this podcast. And it's one of those weekly polls that really is quite sensational. We've got Reform now on 29 points. That's up 3 percentage points on the week. That is Reform UK's highest ever vote share and higher than the Brexit Party ever got when they were on 26. So Reform on 29, Labour down 1 on the week on 22. And then, get this, the Conservatives are now on 17%. Now, the Tories last polled 17% in June 2019 when they're in the middle of ousting Theresa May. So that is going to be a psychologically awful polling result for Kemi Badenoch off the back of those local elections, and suggests that public opinion is worsening or at least stuck in a very bad place around the Tories. What this set of polling means is that actually the polls and the results of the local elections, as calculated by figures like Sky's Michael Thrasher, are now sort of broadly in line with Reform 13 percentage points ahead of the Tories. 13, Anne. What do we make of that?
What we make of this, apart from you can imagine the mood over the breakfast tables, looking at the poll or listening to this podcast in the Conservative parish this morning. And I'm struck by the fact that it was expected to be very bad for the Conservatives, but there's always been a bit of a story around Kemi Badenoch. This is a blip. It's something we can get over because we know that there is an attraction to reform because of our past failings, but actually the government's not doing very well either, etc. If we're all miserable, then everything's okay. But it now doesn't look on these numbers that you've just read out there like a blip. It looks like a feature of where the Conservatives are. And I would be very surprised. I think this is I was going to say a slow burning crisis for the Conservatives. I mean, we know after the results last week that it is more than that. But up to now, they've been able to say, look, this goes to Labour as well. And in fairness, we did that on the podcast yesterday. But I think if you're Kemi Badenoch or if you are in the shadow cabinet or those influential around you, you've got to be saying something either needs to change or drop lead, the leader needs to change.
And it's PM Keys today, so there'll be an opportunity for her to show her mettle or otherwise. One of the only tools that oppositions have is to grab the agenda, to seize the agenda, to get talked about. Now, what do I have this morning from the Conservatives to talk about? Well, the only thing I've got for you, Anne, is something they were quite keen that we talk about on the podcast, but it's Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride, who has announced that he's holding a meeting, right? He's holding a roundtable with his own MPs about the economy. The Shadow Chancellor, Anne, has press released holding a meeting with his MPs about the economy. Now, what else does the Shadow Chancellor do, Anne?
Well, I suppose they hold the meeting and then send another press release.
Yeah. They say it's part of the
I'm getting
policy
a
renewal
disapproving
programme,
tone from Sam Kerr. So you could say holding a meeting in order to do what, right? You might just want to flag in advance. Admittedly, I think it's
Well, let me tell you, the roundtable will engage shadow ministers, we're told, and MPs in examining the UK's lagging productivity, stagnating wages, and comparatively slower growth in GDP per capita, because the Conservatives see the economy as a clear area of opportunity. But I repeat, Anne, if the Shadow Chancellor isn't doing that anyway, what on earth are they doing?
Sometimes it is my role on this podcast to say, "Oh, come on, Sammy, give whichever benighted party or politician is getting the Sam Coates treatment a bit of a chance." I think here's my reading of that. I mean, parties do send out slightly lame press releases, seems to me, where I know that Kemi Badenoch and her lieutenants spent a lot of time in sort of closed council yesterday about the results of the locals and what they wanted to do about that. I think this is a holding moment in which they say, like, we know that we need to pivot to the economy. Expect to hear more from Mel Stride, and this is going to be the next chapter of what we talk about. Now, you can be critical, Sam, that today they just sent out something saying we're going to have a meeting about that and then we'll get back to you. But that would seem to be the message, because we talked about it yesterday, the way that the economy and the decisions about how to run the economy were hitting Labour. The angle where I do agree with you was on the back of these terrible polling numbers, and they can't have come as a surprise to Kemi Badenoch or indeed to Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor. Is it kind of would have been good to have something ready to go on that, saying, yes, we had bad results, but look how Labour has suffered because it has got the wrong economic policy, rather than we are going to have a meeting about that. But, my bet is that we hear something out of that, which says something along the lines of the other side is suffering too, but we are rethinking our position and where we're going to go to get the voters back on the economy. I just felt I had to give them a chance.
However, the Tories did jump, possibly slightly after Nigel Farage, on the bandwagon of the Indian trade deal yesterday. And this is something actually that we talked about yesterday morning, but nevertheless, the government felt incredibly flat-footed on. Let me just tell you what happened yesterday. So for several days, it's been clear, if you read the international wires or the Indian newspapers or some of the UK coverage, that one element of the Indian trade deal was going to be concessions to India about what they call social security. And in other words, an ability of Indian workers who are transferred as part of an intercompany transfer to the UK to avoid paying national insurance for up to 3 years. And also, the employer gets to avoid paying UK national insurance. The argument being that the worker is already paying a sort of social security payment in India, so they don't want to be double taxed. Now, there is no way on earth this wasn't going to be controversial. We were saying it 24 hours ago. And I looked for it in the UK press release when the trade deal was announced yesterday afternoon, which we weren't really expecting it to come yesterday, but it did. And it came with sudden great fanfare and, mini prime ministerial interviews and all the rest of it. But there was no mention of that. So I was like, oh, God, did I get that wrong? And then somebody sent me the extract from the Indian press release, where there it was, up in lights, with the Indians saying, we have negotiated an unprecedented deal with the UK that gives us access, privileged access to Indian service companies that want to operate in the UK. So I sort of posted that on social media, and whoomph, it absolutely took off. And within kind of minutes, quite a lot of opposition MPs who'd tweeted it and criticised it, and was citing this as an example of a sort of two-tier approach. Now, it took the government quite a long time to work out its response, but factually, the bottom line is this, Anne. It was clearly quite an important part of the Indian trade deal, first of all. Secondly, as government officials told me, it is an ask from India and it is a win for them. But thirdly, it may amount to quite a big deal or it may not. But we do not know because even though the government have modelled the costs and the numbers of people from India who might take up this, they are declining to release that information and are just saying we might release it at a later date. So it could be a big deal. It could be a lot of Indians coming over. It could be a really financially advantageous package because we don't know the kind of like-for-like comparison about what they're saving and what they're paying in India and what Brits would get the other way around. But they are choosing not to tell us. And in that vacuum, just about every other opposition MP has piled in. Kemi Badenoch saying she had this deal when she was business secretary and rejected it because it just wasn't right because the number of Indian workers coming to the UK will always outstrip the people going in reverse. Nigel Farage said it's just incredibly toxic, a betrayal of working people. And he actually said to me in an interview, it could be fatal for Keir Starmer, which feels like it's going a bit far, frankly. But nevertheless, that is what he said. So a huge response.
On the government side, what I take from this, also the reporting of my trade colleagues at Politico, who were all over this yesterday afternoon as well, is it is in potential volume terms. I wonder if you're perhaps being a little bit negative on that, Sam, because I think it is potentially quite a valuable deal for the UK. And you are right. You can see how loath Keir Starmer, number 10, is to put actual numbers on this. But there are credible estimates that it is worth a decent amount of dosh, just under 5 billion, about 4.8 billion
Well,
by
hang on on that.
2040. Go on then. Here it comes.
On a moment. This trade deal is worth £4.8 billion by 2040. Now, £4.8 billion is 0.1% of the economy. Now, in order to get this trade deal over the line, the Indians had to concede things, like they didn't push for more visas, which is often their ask, but Britain had to concede things as well. And what it conceded effectively was the services stuff, right? There's nothing about financial services. There's itty bits about some professions, but really services and financial services got left out. This is a small trade deal. Experts.
No, I kind of disagree with you about that, Sam, and I'll tell you why, right? Come on, let me have a moment. Because the whole point of these trade deals, and it's interesting, Kemi Badenoch saying, well, I looked at this and I didn't do the deal. It's not the volume of the headline figure that you put on it now. It's your table stakes on the economy with whom you do the deal. Is it likely to grow? Is it likely not to grow? I doubt you would say, as you say, you would not take this blowback, which we should come on to in just a moment. But a lot of people say this to me all the time about, well, this is a tiny amount of money relatively for a deal. But the fact that you have a deal is also kinetic. It means if the other economy grows, and it is the government's intention, all appearances to the contrary, that the British economy will also grow and that you kind of go hand in hand there. So the fact that you've put if they put a more inflated figure on it and said, potentially this is worth 8 billion, or you would have been, and probably me too, all my colleagues in the press, the first to say, oh, that's not credible because we can't see these figures. So I think they are putting out a relatively modest figure. Where I think you've got your finger on the pain. I've always had that view of trade deals, right? But I mean, you can listeners can complain later about that, or say if they see any evidence for my viewpoint that they are really what you call table stakes. They're not. You never know when you start where you're going to end up. Where there is a pain point is how keen was the government to get this announced right now, that they were prepared to take on what is clearly a big argument about the relative. And it's very smart that you went to the Indian press release, by the way, which I as you know, often do with, the Kremlin one rather than the one that is put out but about the imminent but never there end to the war in Ukraine, because that tells you where the advantage lies right now. And it lies in a place in terms of the relative benefits right now that doesn't look so good. And you can see why, if you're the British government, you don't want to underline or put in great lights the fact that the immediate beneficiaries are on the side of Indian workers, also exempt from national insurance contributions, etc. All the things that you're having domestic arguments about. So for me, it's not the relatively small amount of money on the table right now. It is something that goes to show, hey, we can sign a trade deal, but look at the price.
I think in the end we're sort of in the same place, but I'm talking about it a little bit glass half empty, and you're talking about it a little bit glass half full in terms of the
That would
ambition,
be us, Sam.
which which would be our signature approach to most things. Be that as that may, because there's an issue of migration and there's a perception that the government were quite slow to work out how they were handling all the migration stuff in this trade deal, there was a lot of grumbling last night about it. And I just need to segue quickly onto what I thought was really quite an important challenge that we could spend the last couple of minutes talking about. Now, just after 8 o'clock last night, a couple of Labour MPs started tweeting this statement by what's called the Labour Red Wall Group. This statement by the Labour Red Wall Group, and I'd urge all listeners to this podcast to go on to social media to look up the Labour Red Wall Group, it is extraordinary. It represents an absolute direct challenge to how Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney are running the Labour Party. I'm going to read you a few bits of it. And this is a statement. I checked with one of the Red Wall MPs that didn't want to be named, and they said, yes, it's legitimate, and they think lots of people believe the sentiments of this statement. But so it's really quite a moment. This statement says that the plan for change and the government's response to go further and faster has fallen on deaf ears. So it criticises the response of the government to the local elections. It says, this is our call for action. Visit our areas, listen and rebuild the social contract between government and the people. So it accuses the government and Downing Street of being out of touch. And then it says, the Prime Minister has strong leadership internationally, but it then says, responding to the issues raised by our constituents, including on winter fuel, isn't weak. It takes us to a position of strength. So we have in this statement a direct appeal to Number 10 to U-turn partially or entirely on winter fuel. And then it says Keir Starmer must now break the disconnect between Westminster and the Red Wall. That is an out-and-out attack. I've been looking around social media. The MP for Hyndburn, Sarah Smith, has quote tweeted this statement approvingly. There are others who do it. This has caused a lot of anger in other parts of the Labour Party. One member of the Growth Group was saying this is a direct challenge to Number 10. I can't believe they're actually putting out something that's meant to be that critical. This is a direct attack on the government's plan for change. It feels to me like the tensions inside the Labour Party and the ability of MPs to attack Number 10 directly is quite a thing.
Isn't that where the big story goes next, Sam, in the fallout from last week and the local elections? There's fury, I think, building up across both of the main parties about what has gone so wrong to allow the advance of reform, and also in quite specific areas. And you've just put your finger on one of them. And I think they feel that they're given permission by the advance of Nigel Farage to say things about their leaders and the policies of their parties that maybe just before the election last week we wouldn't have heard, or would have happened more quietly, or we'd have picked it up, or our colleagues would have picked it up and said, we've heard that there's discontent and it's coming out this, that, or the other way. But I feel that the one thing we're often, it's not that I don't think we can't say we're slow to follow as the media, but you have to wait till it's there. But it's a kind of permissive tendency for anger to come out, and I think we'll see a lot more of that. By the way, the only thing I would say is that as this podcast incurable optimist, I must say there are challenges to this default setting at the moment, plenty. You too will have seen, Sam, Playbook reports it this morning, so does the FT, that there is an inkling of that UK-US economic agreement, aka the big beautiful trade deal, being signed very shortly, or even due to be signed this week. And I suppose if you're Keir Starmer, you think, I know I'm going to get this blowback. I know I'm going to have to deal with a lot of discontent on the nitty-gritty sides of domestic policy that you've just begun to reference there. But he hasn't got the Indian trade deal. Sam Coates will complain about it, and McElvoy says all right. But the bigger one is imminent, and so that makes me think that that's where the government is hoping to point us this week. They can not exactly move off the dreadful results, because they're dreadful across the piece. Only Reform is having a great time in the Lib Dems, also to an extent, but that we will be back talking about trade deals, which they might think, with warts and all, criticisms all is better than not talking about trade deals. So there's a classic bit, I should say, can I just add this, from my American colleague saying this is entirely premature, said, a source in the US, it's not prudent to speculate on where these end up. So I think there are still reports that pharmaceuticals are the final sticking point.
I am just reminded of Rishi Sunak during his premiership, who was having a torrid time domestically, and then pulled off the negotiation of the Windsor Framework, so a big international agreement with the EU. And they thought that was a proper reset moment. But trade deals, international agreements literally do not land with the British public. They don't really land with your own parliamentary party. And they're not the great shiny answer to your domestic problems. Solving your domestic problems, solving the cost of living. Now that's the thing that MPs and voters want you to do. Big announcements that promise benefits in 10 or 20 years actually go down slightly with more of a shrug by voters than all the effort that's put into them might warrant. We have gone on over our 20-minute limit, allowing some people who listen to this podcast while straightening their hair to get the job done. But we really ought to wrap it up. And we'll be back tomorrow, Thursday morning, for the final one of the week. Thank you very much indeed, Anne, and we will see you then.
And at least we've got a German Chancellor confirmed for us to deal with on the next big, beautiful EU side deal, which Sam, for a few hours yesterday, which preoccupied me, did not look like we had. Friedrich Merz got over the line there, so he can still take that call, or can take that call now as Chancellor with Keir Starmer. So we might be back on that pretty shortly on this podcast. Bye now.
As you say, we'll deal with him tomorrow. Bye-bye.
The first 100 days might be over, but President Trump is showing no signs of slowing down.
America will soon be greater than ever before.
So we're continuing to follow every twist and turn of this remarkable presidency.
And trying to make sense of what it all means for the US and for the rest of the world.
So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Malika Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Sky News Trump 100, wherever you get your podcasts.